Archaeologists do not have a time machine to travel into the past and observe the actual behaviors and beliefs of the people who made the material culture we are studying. Ancient behaviors may not match the way we behave in the present. For example, today we may structure our economy to maximize efficiency or lower the cost of producing goods and services in order to maximize our profits. Therefore, we may source raw materials and inputs that we use in the manufacturing of finished goods like cars or cell phones from locations closest to where we are producing those products, or that provides the lowest cost in producing those goods. However, in ancient times, this was not always the motive. I present later on in the module two studies from Noel Gale and Bernard Knapp showing how copper and other raw materials used in making metal tools by various ancient communities were not always sourced from the nearest locations. In one example, copper ingots were found in Sardinia that were imported from Cyprus versus coming from nearby sources from Italy. This was determined because each geological source for raw materials may have a different isotopic or elemental composition that essentially serves as a signature indicating the location from where the raw material was initially extracted and used to make the artifact. In the case of their Sardinian copper ingots, the fact that their analysis indicated a Cypriot source suggests there are other motives at play than maximizing efficiency. What those motives were and the reason why the ancient Sardinians were getting their copper from Cyprus or the behaviors associated with those ancient people are hidden and locked away within those artifacts, and ultimately becomes the challenge for us archaeologists in trying to understand or interpret. We cannot see in the mind of the ancient person, and really, it may not be the archaeologist's job to do so. However, uh, we are constantly trying to find meaning within the material record. It is important to realize that both interpretations and the generalizations made about the past are directed by our contemporary interests, agendas, and the sorts of questions that predominate our current political and social thinking. Therefore, there truly is no single perspective that can definitively provide an interpretation of past human societies, and we must realize there is a plethora of potential models and theories that can guide our explanations and interpretations of the archaeological record. The material record essentially preserves the history of the individuals forming the society versus the broad historical narratives or events that affect the society the people who made those artifacts belong to. As Alison Wiley notes, the archaeological narrative that is constructed is not based on a single interpretation, but rather multiple strands of evidence and different lines of arguments. Ultimately, archaeologists, as John Robb notes, are necessarily mythological materialists with only material remains to deal with. Our inferences must be anchored with artifacts. Therefore, the underlying symbolic quality that would indicate the beliefs and behaviors of those who made those artifacts is truly locked away in a box made of amnesia. According to many scholars, however, this makes the symbolic quality of artifacts too remote and too reliant on subjectivity in interpreting such things, leaving the archaeologist to essentially be limited to telling a story in broken pieces focused on specific human activity mostly involved with ancient economies or the technology in which an artifact is made, and political structures and their environmental contexts. The only way we can go into the mind of the ancient person is if there also exists a written record that reveals his or her motives and beliefs. It is important to note that ideas are embodied in the material practices of the ancient people, and the artifacts were originally created by people who had beliefs and motives. We may be able to ascertain how the ancient person made the object technologically and even consider how the artifact functions, indicating its purpose and use. But the object is not void of cultural meaning, separate from its utilitarian and economic purposes. As John Robb states, the archaeological world is a cultural world, and by dividing it into categories of material and symbolic, we deny the degree to which things like economy are fundamentally cultural and things like ideas are embodied in material practices. Therefore, the symbolic truly cannot be separated from an object's economic or material use. Even in our world today, artifacts that we use may have a certain economic and utilitarian function or purpose, but also have symbolic meaning that fundamentally reinforces beliefs and cultural understandings of who we are, the roles we have in society, and different power relationships. As you read in as you read or may have skimmed in the article, What is Archaeology Really? There are a number of theoretical approaches employed by archaeologists in interpreting data obtained from the archaeological record. I will be focusing predominantly on three schools of thought: processual archaeology, post processual archaeology, and cognitive archaeology. Archaeological theories are not the theories in the same way as, say, Einstein's theory of relativity. Archaeological theories are not succinct ideas, but more like approaches to understanding an archaeological site. You could say these are schools of thought about how to interpret and give meaning to the archaeological record. Archaeological theory is not about the ways we go about excavating an archaeological site, but more of a way to understand the archaeological record. Since the 1960s, there has been predominantly two camps in the world of archaeological theory. These are processualism and post-processualism. There has been a long tradition of archaeologists picking one of these two camps and fighting it out, to which approach is best at understanding our past. Processualism or processual archaeology stress, stresses theory formation, model building, and hypothesis testing in search of finding principles or ideas that generally explain human behavior. The processualists advocate logical positivism as a guiding principle modeled on the scientific method. Positivism is the belief that all natural and social phenomena can be understood by determining their origins and causes. Essentially, the processualists hold the philosophical position that we can obtain objective knowledge about the past through a rigid adherence to the scientific method. Further, the processualists rejected the position held by prior archaeologists who applied what is called a cultural history approach, where there was a set of norms held uh, communally by a group of people and communicated to other groups through the process of diffusion. Instead, processualists argued that the archaeological record represents the remains of a culture that developed based on a group's behavioral practices that adapted to specific external environmental conditions or factors. This became known as the New Archaeology. Louis Binford, who's depicted on the left side of the slide, an American archaeologist, pioneered this school of thought and applied its principles to his research involving Upper Paleolithic societies. He examined the archaeological remains left behind by mobile Inuit hunters and gatherers in order to discover patterned, repeatable processes within the deposition of material culture. He used this knowledge to look for similar patterns at archaeological sites left by Upper Paleolithic hunters and gatherers. This research process is known as ethnoarchaeology. Ethnoarchaeology is essentially the application of an ethnographic study of contemporary or modern peoples by comparing the material remains of these modern societies that are similarly situated as more ancient cultures in order to reconstruct ancient lifeways. Post-processualism, on the other hand, was a reaction to the processualist movement beginning in the 1980s and was pioneered by the archaeologist Ian Hodder, a British archaeologist famous for his excavations at Katahoyuk in Turkey, a Neolithic archaeological site representing one of the world's earliest societies, a sort of proto-city settlement in southern Anatolia. Ian Hodder and other post-processualists essentially rejected the deterministic arguments and logical positivist methods used under processualism as being too limited to encompass the wide variety of human motivations. Essentially, the post-processualists argued that archaeologists should pay more attention to a symbolic and structural perspective and held that culture couldn't be reduced down to being a result of a set of outside forces like environmental change, but rather operates as a multivariate organic response to everyday realities. For example, Ian Hodder argued in his work Symbols in Action, an article that I'm including at the end of this module, that the processualists essentially have ignored the true nature of culture, and that while material culture might reflect environmental adaptation, it also might reflect the social variability found within society. I agree with several other scholars who feel that this idea that these two approaches are in opposition is not helpful and can be misleading. In fact, it is possible to merge the two approaches. Let us take, for example, cultural chains. A processualist will say outside factors have led to the cultural change, such as the effects of drought causing people to either migrate to other lands or find methods to irrigate their land in order to sustain the community with needed food supplies. While it is an explanation of change, giving a reason for change to occur, a sort of cause and effect, the post processualist may consider the agency of the individual and consider the context and how individuals within society may bring about cultural change from within. For example, the individual may observe how water flows off from a river and use that observation as a way to develop an irrigation system to better hydrate farming lands to sustain his or her community. However, the problem is hard to find the context to provide this individual agency. But it's not impossible. Bottom line, both schools have merit, and both are trying to work toward a common goal of explaining the human past. And really, early post-processualists were merely criticizing the limitations of strictly applying the positivist approach to the archaeological record. In many ways, these theoretical approaches are a continuum of thoughts merging into each other in hopes to explain our past. There will never be a universal theory of archaeology, like the standard model in physics attempting to reduce the entirety of the universe into a single equation or theory. Human nature is complicated and truly unquantifiable on many levels.